saying that Rome wasn't built in a day. But I saw how quick the decorations went up for the market and the fellowship hall. And let me tell you, around here we just about built Rome in a day. So there you go. Also, someone just gave me this $20 bill. Apparently it was sitting on top of the water cooler. So if it's yours, you can come reclaim it from me after this. Otherwise, it'll bring you in the offering plate, which is a good place for it to be too. So there you go. Well, how do you know if you've made a really good first impression? First impressions can be pretty important for our relationships because they tend to stick with us long term. But today, as we continue on in our series through the book of Ruth, we're going to see that Ruth makes a pretty good first impression. Last week, we were introduced to Ruth through the story of her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi and her husband Elimelech had left Bethlehem during a famine, and they had gone to settle in the land of Moab. But while Naomi and Elimelech were in Moab, Elimelech died, and so did their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And this had left Naomi alone without any male relatives and two daughters-in-law named Ruth and Orpah. Now, since widows in the ancient world weren't really able to support themselves without a male provider, Naomi decides to go back to her hometown, the town of Bethlehem. And her daughter-in-law, Ruth, decides to join her, motivated by a deep love for Naomi and by her decision to follow the God of Israel. And as we jump into chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, we'll see that Ruth's generosity towards her mother-in-law is something that catches the attention of one of the men in Bethlehem. In Ruth 2, it says this: Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." "All right," Naomi replied, "go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather the grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter." Now, if we were to go back to the very last verse in Ruth chapter 1, we would see that the text is specific in telling us that Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. And that detail might not seem significant at first, but the reason why it's important is because it explains why Ruth is so eager to go into the fields and glean from the harvesters. And what's going on here in Ruth chapter 2 is that Ruth is wanting to glean from the leftover grain that the harvesters don't pick up. And this was actually a requirement in the law of Moses, that farmers were supposed to leave some of their crop unharvested, so that the poor, the widows, and the orphans could go and pick it for themselves. We read about this in Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, where it says, "When you harvest the crops of your land, Do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. This system of gleaning was basically God's social welfare system in the Old Testament. The idea was that farmers would intentionally leave behind some of their crop so that people like Ruth and Naomi, who don't have any other means of providing for themselves, could go and pick the grain. And this was an interesting system for social welfare because it created a culture of generosity among the wealthy landowners, but it also still required the poor people to go and work for their food. And I want to take a bit of time to camp out on this idea of a culture of generosity that this system of gleaning was pointing the people of Israel toward. Because when we first think about this, the idea of intentionally leaving behind some of your crop sounds very counterintuitive. For those of you that come from a farming background, you know that your goal is to get the maximum yield off of your land. So the idea of intentionally leaving some of your crop unharvested just seems completely backwards. But this system of gleaning created a culture in the nation of Israel where people recognized that it was their role to care for the poor and the foreigners living among them. And that culture of generosity is often not something that you see in our society today. In our society, we often see providing for the poor as something that's the government's job, not ours. And because of that, a culture of generosity is really the exception and not the norm. But by putting this requirement of gleaning in the law of Moses, God was intentionally trying to steer the nation of Israel toward a culture of generosity. We also see this in the fact that God repeats this command, not just in the book of Leviticus, but in Deuteronomy as well. It says, when you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from the field, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do. Here in Deuteronomy, God adds a little bit onto this command to generosity, stating that when the people of Israel adopt this culture of generosity, then not only will it bless the people around them, but it will be a blessing to themselves as well. And we see this even in Ruth's case, because her generosity and commitment towards her mother-in-law is something that the people in Bethlehem around her are aware of and notice. In verse 3, we're told that Ruth finds herself working in the field that belongs to a guy named Boaz, a man who just happens to be related to her father-in-law, Elimelech. And as the story unfolds, we'll see that this is actually a pretty important thing for us to be aware of. Then in verse 4, when Boaz arrives at the fields, he greets his harvesters by saying, "The Lord be with you." And the harvesters respond saying, "The Lord bless you." Now, doesn't that sound like a great work environment? When's the last time you heard that kind of language on a farm or construction site? I have actually heard of some construction companies where most of the employees are believers. And they listen to worship music all day long and have Bible studies at lunch. But that's definitely the exception and not the norm. What we see even from this initial reaction between Boaz and his harvesters is that Boaz is a godly man. He's someone who keeps the Lord at the forefront of his attention and who wants to steer others toward God as well. Then we're told that Boaz notices Ruth and asks his foreman about her. When he learns that Ruth has been gleaning in the fields all day, Boaz goes up to her and says this. Boaz went over to Ruth and said, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go into any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting and follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I'm only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done." What we see here is that Boaz is being especially generous toward Ruth. He tells her to not go into any other fields, but instead to stay with his harvesters and follow after them. Basically, what Boaz is doing here is he wants Ruth to get first dibs on all of the gleaning in his fields. And he doesn't want anyone to prevent her from doing so. And that is not something that's required in the law of Moses, which was that long list of 613 rules that God had given to the people of Israel through Moses, and included things like this gleaning rule from Leviticus 19. But even though farmers were required to leave behind some of their crop for poor people to glean from, there would have been some less generous farmers who would not have been very happy about this. And it would have made life difficult for the gleaners. And this would have put people like Ruth in a vulnerable position where they would have been susceptible to all kinds of abuse and harassment. But this is also what makes Boaz's provision and protection of Ruth so important in this passage. He's taking a special interest in Ruth and wants to be particularly generous toward her. And we see that this generosity is not really something that Ruth expects. In verse 10, she asks Boaz, "What have I done to deserve such kindness? I'm only a foreigner." Ruth reveals here that she is not expecting to be treated as well as an Israelite, because of the fact that she is from Moab. In the ancient world, there was a distinct difference between how people would treat their fellow Israelites compared to how they would treat foreigners like Ruth. And this reality is also what makes it so amazing that Ruth wanted to go to Israel in the first place. By sticking with her mother-in-law Naomi, Ruth was choosing the more difficult road. She was going to a place where she knew she wasn't likely to be respected very much. But contrary to what Ruth expects, her identity as a foreigner is actually something that helps her to make a good impression with Boaz. Boaz says that he's aware of the fact that she's a Moabite, but he knows everything that she has done for her mother-in-law. She knows that she has left her people and come to a land where she will be a complete stranger. But Boaz sees Ruth's dedication to Naomi as an admirable thing. And he also recognizes this as a decision to follow the Lord, the God of Israel. In verse 12, he reassures Ruth by saying, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done." Here Boaz recognizes that Ruth is a godly woman, that she's someone who's chosen to run towards God during her time of hardship and trial, instead of running away from God. And he wants to reward her for these actions. And while the book of Ruth doesn't specifically say it, I wonder if maybe Boaz's admiration for Ruth as a Moabite who yet chooses to follow the Lord is based on his own experience of seeing Gentiles come to follow God in his own family. If we go to Matthew chapter 1, which outlines the genealogy of Jesus, or the list of Jesus' ancestors, we can see that Ruth and Boaz are in there, but so is Boaz's mom, Rahab. And you might remember that Rahab is the prostitute in Joshua chapter 2 who welcomes in the spies as they're scouting out the land of Jericho. So just like Ruth, Boaz's mom was a Gentile, someone who did not grow up following the Lord and obeying all of the laws of Moses. But she was still able to come to this place where she recognized God as the true king of the universe. And she was still able to be grafted into the nation of Israel and even into the Messianic line from where Jesus, the Messiah, came from. And perhaps the fact that his mom was a Gentile is part of what makes Boaz particularly drawn to Ruth. Carrying on, it says that at mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." I guess that was a good thing back in their day. It doesn't sound particularly appealing to me. But she sat down with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain from right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back to town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked for today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer. All the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So here we see that Boaz continues to increase in his generosity towards Ruth. In verses 15 and 16, he tells the young men to let Ruth gather right among the sheaves the bundles of grain that they have already harvested, and even to drop some on purpose for her. So now not only does he want her to get first dibs on the gleaning, but he also wants her to help herself to some of the grain that his harvesters have already bundled. And at the end of the chapter, we also find out that he invites her to stay with them through the entire barley harvest and even into the wheat harvest in the early summer. So this generosity that Boaz is showing for Ruth is not just a one-time thing. Rather, it's an ongoing thing that extends over a few months. Then when Ruth brings home all of this grain to her mother-in-law, Naomi, Naomi is quite surprised by the sheer volume of grain that Ruth acquires after just one day. And when Naomi finds out that she's been working in Boaz's field, Naomi says in verse 20 that this man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. Now, the concept of a family redeemer, or a kinsman redeemer, as some of your Bible translations may say, is a custom in ancient Israel that's actually quite important for understanding the book of Ruth. A kinsman redeemer was someone who would help to deliver a member of their family from hardship. And there were a few specific ways in which they would do this. A kinsman redeemer was someone who would buy back family land that one of their family members was forced to sell in order to pay off a debt. The kinsman redeemer could also buy back a family member if they had to sell themselves into slavery in order to pay off a debt, which, by the way, was something that was fairly common in the ancient world. And then the kinsman redeemer could also avenge the blood of a family member who was murdered. And as we'll see in the story of Ruth, Boaz does become the one who fulfills this role of a kinsman redeemer by buying back family land that had originally belonged to Elimelech, Ruth's father-in-law, and he also marries Ruth as well. But the interesting part about Ruth chapter 2 is that when Ruth decides to go out into the fields, she just happens to find herself working in the field of one of her family's close relatives, someone who could function as a kinsman redeemer. And many people might just say that that's an interesting coincidence. But really what we see here is the sovereignty of God at work in Ruth and Naomi's life. Now, something that we also need to note is that at this point in Ruth's story, Ruth has not made any mention to Boaz yet about potentially fulfilling this role as a kinsman redeemer. But already Boaz is approaching her with this huge culture of generosity. He's inviting her to stay with his harvesters and get first dibs on all of the gleaning, and is even giving her extra grain on top of this. He recognizes her as a godly woman and wants to reward her faithfulness to God and her mother-in-law. So as we end our service today, I want to remind us that just like Boaz, we also are called to operate out of this culture of generosity. And fortunately, I think that's something that our church already does a pretty good job of doing. We have a church that is eager to help and support the people around us, who recognizes that caring for one another is our responsibility. So let's keep up the good work. Let's keep developing a strong culture of generosity. Amen? Amen. If I can now invite the worship team